Good evening. Today we're learning Parshat Tisa. We're using our scroll Chumash and we are on page 485. Whereas the last two Torah portions spoke about the events of the first year since the Jewish people came out of Egypt that occurred after Yom Kippur, when Moshe came down with the second set of the tablets. This Parsha Tisa speaks about the events that occurred right after the Jewish people received the Torah. And that is why we will see at the end of the Parsha, we go back to all the way from the receiving of the Torah until Yom Kippur. Basically, this Parsha Tisa is going to tell us the missing information. From the time Moshe went up to Mount Sinai for 40 days, what happened while he was away, what happened when he came back, and then he went back again up the mountain for another 40 days, and came back, and again he went up for a third period of 40 days. Altogether, it took him from Shavuot, the giving of the Torah, until Yom Kippur. And after he came back, God gave us the commandment to build the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the portable Beit HaMikdash. And that is why our sages say that the commandment to build Beit HaMikdash was the result of the golden calf that we read about in this week's Parsha. Because the Jewish people made the calf, because they started serving a statue, a force besides God, Hashem said, I can no longer allow Jews to have personal altars, personal mizbeach at home. It must now be a national temple, and the job of servants of God has to be given to one group who are going to preserve it, study it. It can no longer be given to the firstborn of every family, because that can become very dangerous. Every family might decide to make a representation, a statue, an intermediary between them and God, and God forbid there might be idol worship. If not for the golden calf, every firstborn boy would become the Kohen. He would be the representative of the family in front of God, and every family could have an altar, a miniature temple in their home, and they could bring their own offerings. But from then on, no more private altars. It had to be a national altar. Now, what is the reason that the Torah switched places? Why did we put the story of the golden calf after the construction of the Mishkan, or the description of the construction of the Mishkan? And various answers are given, but one simple answer is that we have a rule that Hashem always brings the healing before the disease. Hashem always introduces the cure before the disease, and here this is the cure. The fact that the Jewish people will donate money to the Beit HaMikdash, to the temple, to the Mishkan, as willingly as they donated the money for the golden calf, will be in some measure atonement for them. And even though it happened later, but Hashem already knows the desire, and He put it in the Torah earlier to show. Don't judge the Jews negatively. Don't say, look at them, they took off their gold earrings and they gave it to Aaron to make the golden calf. The Jews are good at heart, and if you ask them to donate to Hashem, to the Beit HaMikdash, they will do it quickly and willingly. And that's what we see they did. And the Jewish people donated so much that Aharon and Moshe had to say, enough, we don't need anymore, please stop. They had to give command, no more donations, we're overwhelmed with donations. God willing, every synagogue and every yeshiva should be able to say that. And again, God saw that the Jews want to serve God. The Jewish people want to give from their heart to a higher cause. And that is why when Moshe wasn't there and they decided to construct an intermediary to speak to God, they said, what? For something spiritual, something that will allow us to connect to God, of course we're going to do it. And they gave their gold earrings willingly. And their intent was not to serve idols, their intent was just to connect to God. And they knew that just like Moshe was an intermediary, a prophet speaking to them on God's behalf, so they thought the golden calf will. They thought that it is just like a microphone through which they will be able to communicate with God. For sure they knew that the calf that they just made themselves is not God. Now let's start the Parsha. First, we finish up the story of the last two Torah portions where the Jewish people donated for the construction of the Mishkan, and various utensils were described. The garments of Kohen and Kohen Gadol were described. And now we explain where did silver come from and where some other utensils and some other things that are necessary for the service in the Mishkan came from. Now, page 485 in Ars Chumash, chapter 30, verse 11. Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, when you take a census of the children of Israel, every man shall give Hashem an atonement for his soul when counting them, so that there will not be a plague among them when counting them. Hashem says, before we go further, let's count the Jews. And again, knowing that this happened after Yom Kippur, after the story of the golden calf, when many Jews died, it's understandable why Hashem wants to count them. Now that some of the Jews fell due to their sins, I want to count how many Jews are left. And Hashem counts them like a faithful shepherd, like a loving shepherd who wants to know the number of his sheep. So too Hashem counts the Jewish people. But interestingly, how does he count the Jewish people? It says in verse 13, this shall they give everyone who passes through the census a half shekel coin of the sacred shekel. And it tells us how much it is. Every shekel is 20 gerah, and they should give half a shekel, which is 10 gerah, as a portion for Hashem. The word gerah comes from the word agora, which means a collection of silver or gold. In this case, it is silver. In modern Israel, they name their coins according to this. Agora is equivalent to our cent, and shekel is equivalent to our dollar. So Hashem said to Moshe, tell every Jew to take a coin whose worth is half a shekel, equivalent to our 50-cent coin. Take that coin and give it to the general collection box. At the end, we will count how many coins there are, and we'll know how many adult male Jews are there. And the question is, why can't you just count every person like they count them in the United States and all over the world? When they conduct census, they count people. Why can't we count Jews? And the answer is right there in verse 2, in verse 12, so that there will not be a plague among them when counting them. Here the Torah tells us a secret, that when you count people, there may be a plague. This is due to ayin hara, to evil eye, when people see that this nation has so many people. Why do they need so many? Why do they multiply so much? That may cause jealousy, and that may cause ayin hara. Another reason the sages give is that we have a rule. Blessing can only rest upon something that is hidden from the eye, something that is modest. When you show off, there is no blessing. And therefore, you have to count your wealth, count your children, count the Jewish people in a hidden way, in an indirect way. In this case, count them through money. We have another case in Jewish history where Jewish people were counted with sheep. Every man would give a lamb. And we have another case in Jewish history where they were counted by pieces of pottery. Each Jew would have to give a broken shard, and then they would count how many shards there are, and they would know how many Jews. Now, this half of a shekel coin was used to construct a part of the Mishkan, and that was the basis of a wooden pillar. The Mishkan had walls which were made from wooden beams standing up, but in order that the wooden beams shouldn't be in the ground, shouldn't be touching the moist ground, and shouldn't rot, they were placed on the silver sockets. Someone is asking when were the Jews counted with sheep and shards, and that is found in the prophets, with David HaMelech, with Shaul HaMelech, and so on. This was some 1,000 years later, or more like 800 years later. Okay, now a question is asked: why was a coin worth half a shekel used? Why didn't they use a coin that's worth a whole shekel? So there are two answers. One answer is that the amount of silver that was necessary for the construction of the Mishkan was enough to be filled with just half a shekel coin given by every Jew. And so Hashem didn't ask for more. That's all we need, that's all we ask for. And the second answer is to remind every Jew that without a friend, I'm only half a human being. Without a partner, without a spouse, without the community, I'm only half. And therefore, the Jews not only were counted, but they were also taught a lesson. Now, the word teruma, which means a donation, is mentioned 3 times in this paragraph. And from here we learn that the Jewish people had to donate 3 separate times. The first time, the time of the census, they donated half a shekel coin to be used for the bases of the beams. The second time, they also gave half a shekel coin, and this was used for offerings throughout the year. They would make a collection, half of a silver shekel coin once a year, and that would be kept in a treasury, and every day they would take some money from it to buy 2 sheep, 1 lamb for the morning, 1 lamb for the afternoon offering. And this lasted them for the entire year. And this way every person contributed only 1 coin, but he was part of every single communal offering throughout the year in Beit HaMikdash. That was the second donation. And the third donation was already all the other materials necessary for the construction of the Mishkan: gold and wool and linen and wood and precious stones and so on and so forth. Now we turn to page 487. Here we read about the construction of another vessel not yet mentioned yet, and that is called the Kiyor, which in English is called a laver. Laver means a wash basin, means a copper vessel, a large copper vessel that contains water, and it has spouts. And Kohanim, before serving Beit HaMikdash, they would sit in front of it, open the spout, the faucet, water would pour out, and they would wash their hands and their feet simultaneously, because they served barefooted, and in order to wash off dust from outside, they would wash their feet as well as their hands. So page 487, verse 17, Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, "You shall make a copper laver, copper wash basin, and its base of copper for washing." Verse 19, "From it Aharon and his sons shall wash their hands together with their feet." Now let's go to verse 22. Here we learn about the anointment oil. Anointment oil called Shemen HaMishcha was olive oil in which certain spices were mixed, and that gave the fragrance to the oil, with which they would anoint Kohanim, kings, and the utensils of the Mishkan, including the Mishkan, to raise their level, to make them dedicated for service of God. Verse 22, Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, "Now you take for yourself choice spices." And it lists the spices. There were 4 spices: pure myrrh, fragrant cinnamon, fragrant cane, and cassia, and olive oil. And make oil of sacred anointment, a blended compound, the handiwork of a perfumer. And now in verse 26 we describe what do we do with it. With it you shall anoint the tent of meeting, meaning the Mishkan, and the ark of testimonial tablets, Aron HaKodesh, the table and its utensils, the Shulchan, the menorah and its utensils, the candelabra, and the incense altar, the altar upon which we burn ketoret, the golden altar, the elevation offering altar, the outer altar made from copper and its utensils, and the laver and its base. Now we're on page 489, verse 30, "You shall anoint Aharon and his sons and sanctify them to minister to me." And as we mentioned before, Jewish kings were also anointed with this oil. This oil was made only once, as it says in verse 31, "This shall remain for me," meaning for God, "oil of sacred anointment for your generations." And verse 32 tells us some prohibitions about it. "It shall not be smeared on human flesh." You're not allowed to apply it to any other human besides Kohanim and kings. "And you shall not duplicate it in its formulation." you're not allowed to make a similar oil with the same proportion of spices ever in history. It was made once by Moshe, and it remained in use throughout the 400 years of Mishkan and 400 years of the Beit HaMikdash. So we used this oil for about 800 years, and it was not diminished. Then at the end of the first temple, one of the last kings, he foresaw that the temple will be destroyed, and he took this oil and he hid it deep down in the tunnels of the Temple Mount. And together with that oil, he also hid all the original utensils, and he made replicas to keep in Beit HaMikdash, so that when Babylonians would destroy the temple and remove its utensils, they would remove the replicas but not the originals. Now, in verse 34 on page 489, we learn about incense that is called ketoret, a mixture of spices that were ground into powder and were used every day on the golden altar to burn with fire to produce pleasant smelling smoke. Verse 34, Hashem said to Moshe, take for yourself spices, and it gives some spices here. 3 spices are mentioned, actually 4, but the Mishnah says that there were actually 11 spices used, and they were mixed and ground. You shall make it into a spice compound, the handiwork of a perfumer, thoroughly mixed, pure and holy. You shall grind some of it finely and place some of it before the testimonial tablets in the tent of meeting. This describes the service of Yom Kippur. Every day we would burn a small portion of it on the golden altar, but on Yom Kippur, in addition to that, we would also burn a little bit or a bit of it in the Holy of Holies, in the Kodesh HaKodashim, in front of the Holy Ark. And this incense was made once a year, and it was divided for all the days of the year, and there is a prohibition for a regular person to make it for his own use. An individual is allowed to make it if he wants to donate this incense to the temple, but an individual is not allowed to make it for his own pleasure. If a person wants to make such a spice, he has to use different proportion of these 11 spices. Then it is okay. Now in chapter 31, Hashem designates 2 people who are going to be in charge of the construction of the Mishkan. Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, see, I have called by name Bitzalel, son of Uri, son of Hur of the tribe of Yehudah. I have filled him with a godly spirit, with wisdom, insight, and knowledge, and with every craft, to weave designs, to work with gold, silver, and copper, stone cutting for setting, and wood carving to perform every craft. Even though Jewish people just left Egypt and they did not know how to be artisans and do all these crafts, Hashem inspired Bitzalel to be able to do it. And he was an expert in all these, miraculously. And he taught other Jews and he supervised them. And behold, I have assigned with him Aholiav, son of Ahisamach of the tribe of Dan. And he also was inspired to know how to do all these crafts. Now here we see that Hashem designated Bitzalel, who came from the royal tribe of Yehudah, and Dan, who came from one of the lowest tribes. And Hashem says, for my service, every Jew is equal. Doesn't matter what your background is, you can be the one to build the Beit HaMikdash. Whether you come from the highest lineage or the lowest lineage, if you dedicate yourself to serve Hashem, you can do it. Now in verse 12 on page 491, we introduce Shabbat. Hashem said to Moshe, saying, now speak to the children of Israel, saying, however, you must observe Shabbat. Why all of a sudden? Why however? And the connection is clear, because just in the previous paragraph Hashem says, build the Mishkan, and this is what you should do: weaving, gold crafting, working with silver and copper, stone cutting, wood carving, build all the utensils, build this Mishkan building, grind the spices, light the fire to melt the gold and silver and copper. However, you must observe my Shabbat. From here we derive that for 6 days you could construct the Mishkan, but on Shabbat you cannot construct Mishkan. And from here we learn what kind of work we're not allowed to do on Shabbat, and that is exactly the kind of work that was necessary for the construction of Mishkan. And that is why when we study how the Mishkan was constructed, we will see 39 various labors, and that is exactly what we cannot do on Shabbat. And it continues, verse 13, for it is a sign between me and you for your generations, to know that I am Hashem who makes you holy. Why do we keep Shabbat? Because it is a sign between us and Hashem. And verse 14, you shall observe the Shabbat, for it is holy to you. Its desecrators shall be put to death. If there are witnesses how Shabbat was desecrated, then there is a death penalty. For whoever does work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among its people. And here we learn about another rule, that if a person desecrates Shabbat without witnesses, then of course there is no death penalty because no one saw it. However, there is karet, and that means cutting off of the soul from the Jewish people. Spiritual excision, we call it. And practically it is recognizable by early death before the age of 60. Of course, not everyone who dies before the age of 60 dies because of this sin, but usually person who is guilty will die early in his life. Now we continue. For 6 days work may be done, and the 7th day is a day of complete rest. It is sacred to Hashem. Whoever does work on the Shabbat day shall be put to death. Now we're on page 493, and here we have the famous paragraph that we say every Shabbat: V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asod et ha-Shabbat lidorotam berit olam. The children of Israel shall observe the Shabbat to make the Shabbat an eternal covenant for their generations. Between me, meaning between God, and the children of Israel, it is a sign forever that in a 6-day period Hashem made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed. When God finished speaking with Moshe on Mount Sinai, he gave him 2 tablets of testimony, stone tablets inscribed by the finger of God. Now, someone is asking a question. Does it mean people who die early desecrated Shabbat privately, and the ones that desecrate Shabbat publicly have death penalty? That is correct. But again, we don't know why people die. Each individual that dies, we don't know the reason. It could be that it is because of karet, but it could be because he finished his mission on earth. Only God knows. But